Okay, hi guys. Welcome to our discussion. We're in a GC2Y class, and we're going to be having a discussion today over feminism and anti-racism. We really do appreciate you all coming out and joining this Zoom to have this discussion. Before we have this discussion, we're going to watch a TED Talk about intersectionality. We focused on this because intersection is a nature of social categorization such as race, class, and gender regarded as creating an overlapping and interdependent system of discrimination or disadvantage. And so it kind of combines both someone's race and gender. And the TED Talk is given by who actually coined the term, who is Kimberly Crenshaw.
You ready, Jenna? Okay. All right, I'm going to share the video, you all.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm gonna name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're gonna see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown. Tamir Rice. Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not gonna put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you could be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them. no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story, because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them do not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the back seat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers. It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. The everyday violence and humiliation that many Black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness to some of this violence. We're going to hear the voice of the phenomenal Abby Dobson. And as we sit with these women, some who've experienced violence and some who have not survived them, we have an opportunity to reverse what happened at the beginning of this talk, when we could not stand for these women because we did not know their names. So at the end of this clip, there's going to be a roll call. Several Black women's names will come up. I'd like those of you who are able to join us in saying these names as loud as you can, randomly, disorderly. Let's create a cacophony of sound to represent our intention to hold these women up, to sit with them, to bear witness to them, to bring them into the light. Say her name. 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 For all her names shall never know. Janisa Bondale, Catherine Johnson, Kayla Moore, Michelle Bissell, Rakia Boyd, Shelly Frey, Tarika Jackson. So I said at the beginning, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. Together, we've come together to bear witness to these women's lost lives. But the time now is to move from mourning and grief to action and transformation. This is something that we can do. It's up to us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
guys, if you can, please turn on your video before we start the discussion, if you can. Few reminders when we're discussing, just be respectful to everyone. You're more than welcome to share your opinion. Just be respectful of everyone's what they have to say. You can use the chat if you want to like ask questions while someone's speaking or make points. But so let's start the discussion. So what from the TED Talk stuck out to you most?
For me, I guess it was just I didn't realize or even think about how all we heard in the news and media was all of the Black men that were getting killed, but how you never heard of like the women. All you heard was the racial violence, and they kind of just left the gender part out of it.
Did something else stick out to other people? Was there something that you guys learned like you hadn't heard about before or thought about from the TED Talk? For me, what I didn't know, basically, because intersectionality was something new to me, learning about it. And so this TED Talk kind of helped learn more about it. And I didn't realize how new of a term it was. And it's kind of interesting that it's interesting that it does have a term for itself because it is so important to realize that someone's race and gender can affect how they are treated in today's society in America.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I've heard the term before and I knew about it, but I never knew how Crenshaw came up with the idea or what made her think of this. So it was really fun to hear about her thought process in coming up with the term and why she decided to come up with it.
Yeah, for me, it was actually kind of the opposite. Like I had heard about the issues with the intersection of race and gender, but I never knew that there was a term for it or that it was like an actual thing. I don't know how else to word that.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to recognize. And so kind of leading more onto like racism, the side of racism, what do you think is like the difference between being anti-racist and not a racist? And like why is it important to know the difference?
I think it's probably easy to say that you're not a racist, but anti-racist would probably be someone who's more actively opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. So it just involves a little bit more effort on your part to raise other people's voices up.
Yeah, I think racism, like I mean, like just like not being racist is just, is so passive and you're kind of like letting the people who have been oppressed like take the lead and like letting them, fight the fight. But being anti-racist is realizing that the issue lies with white people and like it's our problem and like we're the ones that really have to attack it and like fight it and like take the lead.
This is kind of like piggybacking off of it. Like, would you ever like call someone out for saying that they're not racist and just be like, okay, well, why aren't you anti-racist? Is that something that like we should do as people when we hear that?
I think we could pose the question about like why they weren't anti-racist, but also I feel like saying you're not a racist kind of comes from like it's usually defense. So you could kind of go off of that and say, okay, but like here's some other thoughts to just like think about.
Yeah, I agree. I think usually when people say that they're not racist, they're usually defending themselves. And when someone says like they're anti-racist, they're like passionate and like they believe against the fight. So what does it mean to include intersectionality when you're being anti-racist, do you think?
I think it's important to remember that it's not just men in the talk or women in the talk. You have to make sure you're including everyone because that's the whole point of it, is to be inclusive. So it's very easy just to think you're being anti-racist to a certain group and be completely forgetting about another group. So it's really just being aware of everyone else in the room.
And like, are there any other ways you guys can think of how it is beneficial that we include intersectionality when we are saying that we are anti-racist?
This isn't exactly an answer to that question, Jenna, but when you asked earlier around being the difference between like anti-racist and not a racist, and asking like, well, have we ever asked people? I think that's such a good tactic to use, like when somebody is being defensive and saying, well, I'm not a racist, is to then ask that question. So tell me what you're doing that's not racist. I think that's a great way to engage that person in conversation without being like attacking, right? Like you're not being like, you're you know, it's not an attacking thing to ask somebody like, so tell me what you're doing that's not racist. I think I had never thought about asking that question before, so I loved that you just asked that, because that's another tool in my tool belt, so thank you.
Yeah, so this is kind of personal, so if you feel comfortable answering this, have you guys like ever had to have that conversation with someone, being like, having to like just have that awkward talk with someone, being like, okay, you're kind of being racist about this, like check yourself, and they're like, oh, well, I'm not racist, I only believe this part of that and I don't feel like this way?
I think that we can say, I guess for most of us that live in the South, every white dad that we've ever had has had a lot of racist remarks and comments that I've had to talk to my dad about. But I mean, he's very ignorant in his ways, but that's probably the biggest example that I've been like raised with, that you kind of have to stand your ground and not be fed into it, you know? It's really easy just to be like, well, my dad's saying it, but it's just, you have to remember that's their time. Like we can do better than them and learn from it.
What I've done like with my dad is I try to like find experiences that he's had where like he's encounter like anti-Semitism or like personal experiences that I've had, and then I've tried to like experiences that Black people have had and like compare the struggles and like kind of try to make him see it from like their point of view, because I feel like especially with him, like when you just say you're racist, like he just shuts down and he's like, I'm not racist, why would you say, like they get so angry about it. So I try to come at it from like a different avenue.
Yeah, I relate to that because especially with the rise of Black Lives Matter and what happened over the summer, my dad was like, well, all lives matter. I'm like, okay, but this is like why they're out in the streets protesting and like why Black Lives matters do matter. And so I relate to that with white dads.
But I think it's also totally fair if you don't feel comfortable having the family conversations, that's not necessarily the stage that everyone is at. I mean, even for me, it's sometimes easier to have the conversations with people who aren't so close. So if you feel badly that you're not able to stand up to your family, I don't think you should give up. Families are kind of the hardest people to try to convince, in a way, it's easier to talk to strangers because you don't have all of those fraught personal connections. So, I mean, I think it's important to think about this work in terms of where you are too, right? Like not everyone is going to be able or comfortable doing the same kind of work at the same time, right? But it's about thinking about what can I do? Like what is a step for me?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And kind of piggybacking off what Jenna said about Black Lives Matter, I feel like this issue is really important with what's happening today, right now. And like, do you guys can think of like any event or anything that's happened recently that kind of highlights this intersectionality or like juxtaposition that women of color face in media or with any circumstances that are happening today?
I think a great example that I could think of is actually from the book that we're reading in class that I know she's smiling. She's like, yay! The first chapter about Hillary Clinton and like all the like how she was completely torn apart just because she was a woman, and how easy it was for people just to hate on her and not respect her as a person because they would just go, oh, she's a woman. And they couldn't see her as a politician or anything more than, I guess, a housewife in their minds. So it was really difficult for her campaign to actually get any traction and get voters.
What I can think of is like, this is like 10 years ago, but when Obama first started his campaign, Michelle Obama, she faced a lot of like criticism in the media. She was painted as an angry Black woman, and she like, just because like, cause she was on the campaign trail with her husband, like if she wasn't living up people's expectations of what a Black, like people were already upset that a Black man might be in the White House, that here's this Black woman and she's not living up to like people's expectations or stereotypes. She faced like a lot of criticism, but she showed that like women of color can get to the White House in some, like not exactly in her way, but like they can get into politics and make change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. For me, when I watched this video and I thought about stuff that's happening today, I really thought about the Breonna Taylor case and everything that's going on with that. I don't know if you guys, did anybody know about that case? You can like raise a hand or something if you know about it. Yeah, okay. So it's basically just this Black woman that got killed in her apartment after her boyfriend started shooting at the police when he didn't know it was police. They unlawfully entered his apartment for an illegal search and seizure, and he thought it was an intruder. So in self-defense, he shot, and then the cop shot back, and it ended up killing her in her sleep. And a lot has happened with that, and a lot of people have been wanting for justice to be served, I guess, and for stuff to happen for that, and not much has come of it. And so this just really made me think of that case and how Black women really don't get the justice they need in the system because their things aren't taken seriously. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah. So like, in what ways is intersectionality, like the concept of it, important? Like, do you guys think it's important? Do you not think it's important? If you do or don't, why?
So I think that it is important, kind of how Jenna was talking about, we have these specific expectations and standards for specifically women of color. It kind of brought me back to our Beyonce discussion and how everyone kind of had this role for her to fill and she didn't fill it. So I think that it's needed just because we'll fix these issues a lot better if we can really understand the specific issues that people are facing. So we mentioned about in court, how if we had this term, we could better understand that these issues are a lot more complex than just, black and white. And we can probably, address our society and our politics to just being more inclusive.
I agree. I think in order for change to be made, it's really important for people to be able to understand the different levels of things, and like there's more to this the surface level than what we know. And I think it's important for people to go deeper and understand more than just what they know or what they think they know in order for change to be made. So, could you think of any examples where intersectionality will like benefit you or someone you know in your life, or ways that you hope to be able to help someone benefit from it?
I think it would definitely help most women, especially women of color, because it's so, like they said in the video, it's so easy for people to say, like, I've definitely seen in like my mom's workplace, the lack of color and how you have your men, and that you can say, okay, they can be black and white, but then for some reason, there's always like a missing spot for everyone else. And it's so easy just to look over it and glaze over it and think it's okay because it's always been like that, but it's not okay. And it's now that like we're all becoming aware of it, I think it definitely helps to integrate like the changes that we want in our future. So when we're in the workplace and we're going up in the rankings, we can go, okay, this is what not to do. This is how to be inclusive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
I
think
think
it's
that,
also
oh,
really
sorry, go
important.
ahead.
You know, I just want to mention, I think it's really important that intersectionality is about a lot more than just race and gender. It's about sexuality and gender. It's about gender identity. It's about socioeconomic status. It's a lot more than just race and gender. It deals with how any identity you might have can affect the oppression that you face or the discrimination you face. I think that's why it's so important, because it's not just about race and gender. It's about almost anything.
Yeah, and I think once you start thinking about intersectionality as a concept, then you can start seeing whether how that applies to your life, right? It's like if you aren't thinking about the fact that there are very few non-white people on campus when you're looking around, you may not think about that, right? I mean, you're just kind of doing your thing on campus, but once you're made aware of something, we've talked about this in my classes before too, it's like then you have to either do something or you don't. It's like you look away or you see it and you act.
I think too, when we start to notice places where intersectionality matters, like when we start to see those places where two systems of oppression, or sometimes three or four, right? Like it's not just limited to two systems of oppression that somebody could face. Like I think about Black trans women, right? Like that's somebody who's facing multiple different kinds of systems of oppression. But when we start to notice and see those places, then we can change our policies and practices so that if we're centering those people, if we're centering the people at those intersections, then that benefits everybody. Like by having a process that's fair for the person who is at the center of all of the intersections, then like that makes everything fairer for everybody else. Which is, I think, sometimes something that folks miss when we're talking about intersectionality. That like when we raise up the people who are most impacted by systems of oppression, then like we create a fairer, more just world for all of us, which is kind of cool to think about.
And I don't know that much about intersectionality, but so this is kind of a question more than a comment. But wouldn't it involve like Hispanics and Asian populations that aren't like the typical white things? So when we think about these issues, we typically think about women of color, but I know I have friends that are Hispanic and Asian that also like have issues.
Yeah, so especially kind of bringing it back to the class, there was like one of the optional readings was kind of focusing on about Native women in America, like I think there's Cherokee tribe, and they face oppression because if they experience a crime of rape or assault or murder on their territory, it doesn't go to the, like it doesn't get tried, like they don't get the justice that they need, like it's just overlooked. And so a lot of like Native women are like the largest population, or like the biggest percentage of like women and people in America that are murdered, killed, raped. And so it's important to include them, especially because there's the Women's Act of Equality, I think, I don't remember exactly what it's called, where like they should be included in these like acts where they're thought of too, because they're also facing different types of oppression than Black women, Asian women. Like, it's important to think of like everyone in those aspects. So yeah, it does include everyone.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand that women of color isn't just Black women, it's Asian women, it's Native women, it's non-white Latino women. It's like every woman that doesn't benefit from whiteness. I feel like that's really important to.
All right, well, I guess we'll move on to the next segment if no one else has anything to do or has anything else to say. Me and Brett are going to be kind of leading the discussion on what we can do next, and what can we do about these issues that we see in intersectionality. So the first question is, how do we fix some of the issues of discrimination based on the overlapping factors that we see in intersectionality that you learned about in the video? What can we do about that? It's a very broad question, so take your time.
That's a great question. So think about, like, what can you actually do? Like, after this event, what can you do to make a difference?
Okay, can I respond to that? Okay, well, I'll respond. Dr. S, you said in your class, and I think is a really important point to point out, is that you can't just merely just say that you're not racist. You have to be actually anti-racist and take steps to speak out and bring awareness to it. I think that's really important to do.
Yeah. Oh. Go ahead, Jenna.
No, you can go, Brett.
Okay. Well, I think it was one of the questions on our midterm self-assessment. Actually, it was like, what would you kind of take from this class and actually use and whatnot, rather than just like learning about it. And I think that's kind of relates to this, because, I mean, you can learn about it as much as you want and like understand these things, but like it's actually what you do with them. And personally, like I've never really like been educated on any of this, I guess, before this course, and I feel like after this course I'll be able to actually try to actually make a difference and use it, you know, just by literally anything else other than not doing anything. And I feel like that's a huge step, and like the only step that you have to take. And I feel like not a lot of people, including myself, do that. And I haven't really thought about that until like right now, but I feel like that's important.
Yeah, I like that. Like, you do literally anything other than not do anything at all.
One of my favorite quotes about like being anti-racist is a quote by Beverly Daniel Tatum, and in it she's talking about that, like, the system of oppression of racism is like a moving sidewalk at the airport, right? And like we are all on that moving sidewalk, and it's like it's like just moving us in this direction, right? So if we do nothing, then we're still moving in that direction, like still moving with the flow of racism. But that being anti-racist is about like turning around and like walking backwards on that moving sidewalk. And she really gets it, like that's the kind of action that it takes. And like it's uncomfortable. Like, like I've walked backward on a moving sidewalk to like go fetch one of my children, and like it's weird feeling, right? Like it feels weird and awkward and it's uncomfortable, but like that's how, like that, when I read that quote, that was something that really shifted my perspective, and really made me think like, oh, I can't just stop moving, right? Like I can't just stand still. Like I have to do something.
I think something that's really important, like moving forward, especially because there is an election, like early voting started already, that like you actually do go out and vote and like pay attention to what like the candidates are standing for and how they reflect your own views and what the change you want to make. And especially like being a part of the like population that is least likely to show up to the polls and vote, like, but like we made media coverage. Like we went out and protested. Like we're a majority of the people that protested, like might as well be the majority that go and vote. And so I feel like that's really important to do, like outside, like just to go and vote, because that also does make a change, even though some people say it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So the next question, I want to specifically connect it with the Crenshaw video, where she talks about police violence against Black women. She brings up all these names of these police killings against these women. So, what changes should be made to law enforcement to prevent violence against minority groups and women?
I think the first step is probably like more sensitivity training, like have required training that every officer has to go through and be like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert. I don't know exactly what would be in the training, but like make sure that they're having these discussions. And then I think like there's this culture of like, even if like all the officers aren't perpetuating violence, there's a culture of like letting it happen and not reporting it. And you know, like being afraid to like be a snitch. And I feel like that culture has to be kind of like destroyed. Like people like somehow like they shouldn't be afraid to speak up if they see an officer do something, or you know, stop an officer from like committing violence, or I don't know how that would happen, but I think that needs to happen.
I feel like that situation would be a little bit harder, but and this is kind of related. And I'm a nursing major, and so in one of my classes, we were talking about how it used to be such a stigma to report mistakes, and so the nurses would just like get away with all this stuff, and it was harming the patients. And I think that that could relate somehow to this, as far as like making it mandatory to report some of these. I think it's a little bit harder, but once we get rid of that stigmatism of like, oh yeah, people do make mistakes, but we need to stop the like intentional bias.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to make a point. A lot of people say they want to defund the police. That's what a lot of people want to do. But I actually have a different answer. I think that we should release all nonviolent. We should just get rid of all a lot of police citizen interactions, like releasing all nonviolent prisoners from jail, legalizing all drugs, lowering the drinking age. I think this would cut down maybe 50–60% of all police citizen interactions. That would give police less reasons to get involved in our daily lives. And I think there will be a lot of less deaths of minority groups, and not just minority groups, but all people. I think that would help.
So kind of switching gears, I guess, from that topic, is the idea of privilege, I guess. And I know within our class that we talked about it a bunch, but what are some ways that people can kind of look at their own privilege and kind of acknowledge it? Because I feel like a lot of times people don't. So I feel like what's some ways that people, I guess, could break down what exactly they have that others don't, even if they are discriminated against? You know what I mean? Like, what are some ways that people can do that?
I'll say so. I know one time in high school, in one of my English classes, we were doing an activity where we like all started at the same line, like everyone lined up, and then my teacher was like, if you have this or you don't have this or blah blah, step forward. And so basically, people who were more privileged basically ended up being more at the front, and then everyone in the back, and then at the end just like look around and see who's behind you, who's in front of you, and like where you are. And I think just things like that, and just looking at other people's experience and comparing it to your own can definitely like be an eye-opener and see what you have compared to other people. So yeah, I think that's pretty interesting.
I think like one of the biggest things I've taken away from like privilege is that like you use your privilege for good and for like other people who don't have the same privilege as you. And especially like when there are the issues that were going on in our country right now, like if they're not going to listen to like whoever, like if you think they're going to listen to you, might as well like speak up and speak for them. And I think, I mean, your privilege can be used for good and not like it can't, like sometimes it can be held against you that you are privileged, but like if you're using your privilege in a way that's benefiting for others, like you're doing a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are so many opportunities in your life, like, you know, even like at the workplace, like if you're a hiring manager, you know, and you see that some people, like someone isn't being hired and like you think that's because of their race or their gender or their sexuality, or like you see that someone's making less than someone else, or like even in school, like if you hear people making comments or you see someone being treated unfairly, like it's just being aware of things that are happening around you and then like speaking up about it and like doing whatever you can to be an advocate and like fixing the problem in a way, like especially if you have privilege, like you're in a unique position where you can like do things that like people who are being oppressed can't, and like maybe they're afraid to speak up or they don't want to be labeled or you know whatever, and like so you can use your privilege to speak up and change those things.
Yeah, and sometimes just asking questions is holding people accountable, putting things into the light, like, oh, you preferred this candidate over the other. What is did that have something to do with race? I mean, sometimes, you know, you don't have to be quite so direct, but there are ways of putting things sort of into the conversation in the form of a question that can be less maybe intimidating. And if you're not the person who's being directly impacted by it, you're kind of in a privileged position in that moment, no matter what your privilege level, because you're not the one who's being impacted. And to just ask questions, hold people accountable. Like, why is this? Why am I seeing what I'm seeing?
I think asking questions is honestly like the first step and the easiest step too, like moving forward with that, because the hardest part I feel like is acknowledging it. And I think it was in one of the essays that we read from Roxanne Gay and like the bad feminist, I think it was, when she talked about privilege, and she said that like the hardest part was acknowledging it because a lot of people get defensive and they want to like fight off and say they're not, and like they just try to defend themselves rather than accepting it and like just moving forward. Because she said even just by you accepting that you have privilege, you're already ahead of the people that just keep denying it, and you can try to use that to benefit others. And I feel like that was pretty powerful because like I mean, I feel like I myself have not acknowledged, I guess, everything that even the fact that we're all in the Zoom right now, like shows, I guess, that we're all pretty privileged that we can even do this. And I feel like even her, by saying that, because she was like heavily discriminated, and the fact that she acknowledged that she was privileged over people still kind of, I guess, shows you how far that privilege can go despite where you are, because there's always somebody worse off than you. And I feel like acknowledging that is pretty important and like moving forward and making that like better as a problem.
Speaking of moving forward and acknowledging privilege, it has been a privilege to have you all here tonight. It's been a privilege to speak on all this, and we've had some lovely points in our discussion, from the finer ethics of a bare knuckle brawl of verbal discussion with family to what it means to be an active anti-racist, to what we're born with, the privileges of being born in such positions, and the problems faced. So underneath the light of Crenshaw's eye-opening video, are there any last questions, concerns, comments before we take this knowledge and spread it forth, sharing it with the world and thus making it a better place? If not, I bid you all good night, good evening, and I forget the third thing, but stay safe.